Alright, so with this new controller added, based on the template of entity framework, we specified the model. It figured out the only entity framework context that we have. It assigned that to it already, and it is saying that do you want to generate views? With this option checked, it is going to generate all the views. And now if I hit the add button, notice multiple things in the views folder that's going to happen. So scaffolding is a process in which this entire folder structure is going to get created. It's going to have the basic HTML template as well. There was an error running the selected code generator, could not load file or assembly.sql server version this. Let me go ahead and cancel out of this. And alright, so sometimes cleaning and rebuilding helps. The reason for that could be that the code that is looking up in our assemblies, it is going to run through the DLS, and it is going to cross-reference through those DLS before it can come up with this code. Alright, with the code ready, let's go ahead and start analyzing this application again. Once again, all the references have been added for entity framework and the model classes that we have. The controller class is inheriting from the controller base class from MVC, and then it has automatically created a private variable of the DB context, which is getting assigned a value inside the constructor. Right? So this university context is going to get is going to get injected in the constructor from the startup.cs, and it has multiple actions: the index action, details action, create action, there is another create action, and there is an edit action, and there's a second edit action, and last there's going to be at least one delete action, and there's a delete confirmed as well. So let's go ahead and start looking at these one by one. The index action is taking the context object, connecting to students, and it is doing an include, of course. This include, let's go to the definition of include and read through the documentation. It actually represents a database join. So specified related entities to include in the query result. It is a navigation property because it is connecting two data types. So if we go to this university model, the reason it is putting that value is because we have this property added, and in entity framework core terminologies, it is called a navigation property. Now, it is the include code says that the navigation property to be included is specified starting with the type and entity is being queried. So when we are requesting a copy of student, it is also getting a copy of the course data. So with this included, it is going to have a university context. This name could have been different, and then it is doing toList asynchronous, right? Because database read is a slow operation, MVC is going to recommend that we use the asynchronous implementation of toList. If you remember toList from our entity framework discussion, it is going to force the execution of the query that we are generating over here. Right, so .toList is going to make what all the filtering, all the selections that we have done over here, it is going to actually execute on the database. And because database is a slow operation, we use the asynchronous implementation. Asynchronous implementation is going to return the control back to the caller, and it is going to continue waiting till the result is available. Once the result is available, it is going to pass that data to the view. The view is still going to take the enumerable of student. It is not going to take a task. It is not going to take a task because we are using the await keyword here. So the await is going to give you the result. And to go to the view, I'm going to right click and choose go to view. And this go to view has a model pointing to or model of type a collection and enumerable of the student. Now with this added, the rest of the code looks exactly what we saw in the home controller action as well. For that, I'm going to come here and delete this. Right, the index action is the same. Now, if you scroll down and look at the details action, the detail action has a nullable parameter of the type ID. The question mark here indicates that it is perfectly okay to pass a null over here. But then when you pass a null, we are going to return a not found value. Let's just go ahead and hit F12 and go to definition of not found. And not found is a result type. And it's going to say that create a not found result that produces a HTTP response of 404. Right? If I go to the definition of not found result itself, it's going to say it is a status code result. And once again, you're going to see action result. Right? This is the same thing that we saw in the home controller, that everything is an action result. Right? An action result could be a view, could be a PDF or an audio file. So going back to the student controller, when you run into elements for which you don't have a result, you should return a 404 option, and 404 can be returned using this particular action result object. Right? Because the ID is not null, we're going to continue with our query. It's going to take student and it's using the first or default async implementation. It is similar to the where clause, but then where is going to give you a collection, and if you want only the first element from that collection, you can pass first. But then there are other overloads of first available, which will let you do first or default. And we're going to use the asynchronous implementation because once again database operations are slow. The await is going to put the only single result that we expect for this ID, and it is going to bring back that student result. And once again, if the student result is null, we're going to return a 404. If we find that result, we're going to go to the view and display that one single student's information. So let's right click and go to that view and analyze this code. So once again, the model this time, it is not a collection, it is a single object of type student. If I go to the definition of this, we are back to our model class where we have this student definition without any frills. It is a DTO, a data transfer object, that we are using for communication between the controller and the view. I'm so sorry, between the model and the view. Right? The controller is kind of mediating the communication between these two entities. It is separating out data extraction and the data source from the view. So the data is generated here using the model classes, and it is passed on to the view. And in the details view, we have that single object. Once again, we are influencing the title. In the div, we are taking student. We are generating all the labels over here. And alongside the label, we are also displaying the values of those labels. So it is display name for, and then these model classes, right? So let's see this. Let's go ahead and execute this code and see the index and detail actions. Alright, so once again it fired up a browser, I'm so sorry, a console window, and the console window is going to print all the logs that we are listening to HTTPS localhost 5001, and it brought this menu here. Now if I hover over this, because of the navigation element that we added yesterday, it is going to home/student, but then we have already removed that action, right? So we're going to see a page not found error here. We'll have to go back to our code and correct that action. So in the home controller, we don't have the student action, we have the student controller present right here. Let's come to the shared view underscore layout, and to add the student model, we're going to repeat this code. We're going to get rid of this navigation element, and instead of home controller, now student has its own controller, and the action is index. We're going to call it students. Right, now if I hit Control F5, and hover over student, it is not going to home/student, it is now going to the student controller itself. Notice that there is no index, and I'll have to match the name of the controller, students. So once again, it has launched the Kestrel server and this browser instance. And now if I go to students, the default action of any controller is the index page, and this time it is complaining that the column name grade is not present. So while we were trying a couple of things yesterday, we added a grade property somewhere in the course table. I'm going to get rid of that, and this time if I go to the students controller, it is going to get all the data for us. Now notice that students is a controller name, and we did not specify any action. The default action of a controller is index, and if I have to show you in the code where we have configured it, go to the startup.cs file, and you will notice that if you don't specify a controller name, it is going to pick up the home controller, and if you don't specify an action, it is going to pick up the index action. And then this ID property here is an optional property. So by default, if you only specify it is going to go to home index action with an optional parameter. But as you start specifying controller names like students, it is going to go to the index action. And if you want to go to a different page like detail, it is going to go to student controller, the details action, and it is not going to take any parameter because it is optional. And if you want to pass an ID parameter, you will have to pass it using id equal to 10, for example. So let's go ahead, and our application is still running. Let's go ahead and go to this URL, and you can come and enter the URL here like so, and there's getting information of Seymour Hoffler. All right, with the back to list option, we can go back to the element, or with the edit, we can once again go to the in the on the bottom left of the screen, we see student.edit.10. If I hit on this edit button, it is going to give me a nice option of editing. And once again, because of the include option in our queries, we're going to see all the course IDs here. And so I can choose 2, I can hit save. It's going to complete for student number 10. Once again, I can go to details slash id equal to 10, and it's going to show me that the course enrolled is 2. Right now, what we've seen so far is that, let me close out of all of this, close all of this. Right, what we have seen so far is the index action and the detail action. They only had single appearance or presence in the page, but then if you look at the create action, there are 2 create actions. Let's go ahead and set a breakpoint on this and this one here, and notice a nice handy tip here that if you want to access this particular action, you can go to students/create. So I'm going to come to this page and I'm going to enter this students/create, and if I enter this if I hit enter, I'm going to come in the first implementation of the create method. Now I'm going to hit F10, just go repeat. I'm going to stop this. Looks like I've pressed some keys accidentally, and hit F5 again. So we are back to the home page of the application. I'm going to go to the student action. I can hit this create button here or enter the create URL. Let's go ahead and click this link. And once again, we are back in the create function. Now, if I hit F10, right, it is generating a list of values. So it is fetching the course indexes for the create page. I'm going to show you what that is. There's a view data, and we have assigned a bunch of course IDs to it. And if we go to the view this time and look at it, it is taking the student model, and we are seeing a new element. We have not seen form element so far. Excuse me. So a form element is going to give the HTML page an ability of posting data back to the server. Right? Look at these statements here. Now there's something called as validation summary. We're going to talk about that very soon. But then the form group, if you remember from our HTML week, where we talked about HTML and Bootstrap, form group is for creating input forms. So this is where we are going to accept the user input, and in the end, so we are taking input for first name, last name, and the course that we have for which we would want to enroll. There is a button of type submit. When you see the type as submit, it is going to invoke a post action, and the data that is present inside the form element, it is going to get submitted to the server side. So this is where all the HTML is going to get generated. This is going to be the label, and the input is going to be the text box for the first name, a text box for last name, and a drop down for the course ID. And there's going to be an action going back to the list, and there's a script element over here which is doing validation, right? So if we enter a value that does not um, meet the validation rule, this script is going to kick in, and when this script returns, so when the validation of the script completes, it is going to activate this element here, and all the errors that are there in the page, we're going to see it over here. For now, we are withholding the control at the view. I'm going to hit F5, let this control go, and it's going to generate the UI for us. So this text box here is coming through because of this statement here. Input ASP for the first name, and the UI element itself is form controller, or the UI class is form controller. So we are creating a student. Let's go ahead and enter my information, and the drop down is picking up values from the select list statement. So I can pick up 1, 2, 3. I can hit the create button. As soon as I hit the create button, we are going to hit the other create function, right? So the name of these two actions is the same, but then this second function is modified with an attribute, and that attribute is HTTP post. Post is when you are generating, when you are on the same page and you are posting data back to the server through a form element and through an action like this. So it is this form element and this input type equal to submit. It is causing a post of the data that we created over here, and that data is available to this particular action through another attribute modifier, and it is taking the ID parameter, first name, last name, and goes, because these are the fields inside the student class. And if I hover over the student and select it, we're going to see all those three values. So course ID is 3, first name, last name, and the ID is set to 0 because we do not provide the ID ourselves. The ID is something configured at the database level for auto increment. So we are not going to create that value. We're going to pick up the student object and we're going to add it to the context. And if you remember our discussion on entity framework, if I go back to our immediate window, type entry and pass the student over here, we're going to see not attached in the beginning. It is the state is detached. I could have used state as well, right? It is detached at the moment, but then if I hit F10 and run this code again, it is going to say that it is added, right? This added here indicates that when we call save changes, right, it is going to persist this modification in the database for us, right? So let's hit F10 once again. It is an await because database write are slow operations, and await is only possible inside asynchronous method. So it's going to go save that data, and if I run it third time, it is saying unchanged, right? So it was detached first with .add, we changed it to added. Entity framework or the DB context started tracking this object that whenever save changes is called, I'm going to run a query called insert into student table. I'm going to add that value, and when that write is complete, it modified the state of the student once again and made it unchanged because it has not been modified yet. And now if I hit F5, right, I should have shown it to you that there is another action that we are calling, which is it's called redirect to action, and then the action name that we specified is the index action. So from when the edit is completed successfully, it is going to come to the index action and it is going to display the entire page with the last record as once again my name and the course for which I have enrolled, right? And for some reason the edit that we made, it kind of pushed down to the end, right? So create is going to have two actions, one for HTTP GET and the second for HTTP POST. HTTP GET happens when there is a fresh request that is coming in for that page. The fresh request generally comes in when you go to the browser and hit the go button or the enter key through the URL option. But then post, it happens when you are on the page with a form element in it. If I go to the page source, why is it doing that? If I go to the page source, you're going to see a form element specifically for that section. And with this form, there's a method called post. And when a submit action is called, which is through this button, it is going to invoke this particular URL with this particular method, right? And we have specified that through these two options. The data itself that is going to get posted, we can bind it through multiple options. This is just one of those options, right? All these properties, they're going to get assigned to the member here, and then in this member we are going to add it to the student context, and it's going to get saved through this save changes async function call, and after a successful execution, it is going to return to the index page. Right. There is another statement in this code which is called model state.isValid. Right. When we receive data inside this parameter here, it comes in with a verification applied. So if I go to the definition of student, there is no special syntax or special validation rules that we have assigned here. So let me go ahead, and because I'm going to modify C# code, let me stop debugging, and over here I'm going to say, I think it is max length, right? Maximum length I'm going to give is, say, 5. For a longer name, it is going to fail. And let me go ahead and change the last name to required. So they have to enter some last name and a maximum first name of the max length should be 5. I'm going to hit F5 again. Go to the student controller, hit the create link. It's going to generate the initial UI with the form element, and now if I provide a long name and leave the last name empty and hit the create button, alright, it's going to say that last name field is required. And probably I should have, okay, I'm not able to enter the text more than 5. Right, it is not allowing me to type. Right, so that validation is applied at a different level. But notice this error message here. This is coming because of two things. The first is this statement here, max length of 5, and the second is a little sneaky. There's a section that we have added with @section keyword, and we have called it the script section, and over here we have included an asynchronous JavaScript. Right, this script tag itself is defined, if you remember, is in the _layouts page. Right, and over here we had one for the render body and the second for render scripts. So there's a section that we can add to our Razor pages. If we use the correct names, it's going to pick up the name from here, and it's going to look in the layout file and replace the code that we have written there with this particular section. So notice that there are like already 3 scripts, and we are injecting a 4th script specifically for the create section. And if you go to the UI of the page and select view page source, we are going to see a couple of scripts more. So there were 3 scripts in the layout page. Through that statement, there were two scripts that got added, and if you read through the name, it is jQuery validation, right? And the second is jQuery validation unobtrusive. So it is through these two JavaScript files that it is on change of scope, right? It is coming out, and as I type in it, it executes those JavaScripts and it makes sure that the validation rules are getting applied, right? So the JavaScript code is going to get generated on the server side. It's going to get attached to those files, and it'll get pushed into or added into the source of this particular page, and it's going to do validation for us. Right? If I hit the create button, the model state is valid. I'm thinking of a scenario where this is valid is going to be false. Right. So that is going to come back. So on the similar lines, the way we have create as two separate actions, one for HTTP GET, one for HTTP POST. There is the edit works on the same lines, right? So the edit action is very similar, just that it is taking an additional parameter. During create, we don't know the ID, but edit only applies to an existing entity, and the URL pattern is going to be like this: student/edit/NID. And then if ID is null, we're going to say 404 that this ID is not found. Once we find that ID, we are going to extract out the student information. If the student is not found, we are once again going to return not found. Otherwise, we are going to redirect it to a page with edit information. So if I hit on go to view, let me show it to you in the Solution Explorer as well. So the Solution Explorer has a razor view for the edit syntax, and once again it's taking a model. It is not a collection, it is a single student object, and once again it has a forms action which is going to go to edit, right? It is going to generate the URL/student/edit and a method attribute which is going to be post. And once again we have an input of type submit. It's going to generate 3 elements: first name, last name, and a validation text. And over here, once again, we have a validation script. Once we hit the submit button, it is going to invoke the post action of the student controller, which is exactly under it. The HTTP post of edit is going to get called, but this time the parameter list is a little different. This ID parameter is going to come from the query string, and the rest of the parameters, they're going to come from part of the body element. And probably I can take this opportunity to explain what HTML headers, query string, and body elements are. But let's go ahead and put a breakpoint over here and another breakpoint over here. And our application is already running anyway. So I'm going to select the first record, hit the edit button, and it came to this action method which is not modified. So if you don't mention anything like HTTP post is mentioned here, if you don't mention any attribute on an action, it is by default assumed to be HTTP GET. The ID is assigned value 11. This is from the query string or the URL. ID is not null, so it's going to fall through. It's going to extract out the student information. Let me hit Control F10 at this point, and we have the student information, which looks correct. And because it is not null, it is going to fall through, extract out the list of courses, and generate the edit view. Right? The edit view is populated with values by default, and now we are seeing that error message that the first name must be a string or array, type of maximum length of 5. Because this name is a little bigger, it is going to complain. I am not sure if I can hit the save button with the error message on the screen. Let's go ahead and try that anyway. right? And it is setting the focus of the drop down to this button with the error message. So I'm going to have to drop the name size and hit the save button. And once again, we are back to the HTTP post method of edit. The ID is once again 11 and the student information is modified to a shorter name. And now if we continue down this, it is there are a couple more validation this time. It is running the update query and then update once again. So let's go ahead. I forgot showing you the state. If I type this code again, it is saying modified. Right, remember seeing unchanged. When you don't do anything to the student object, it is going to come out unchanged. And when you start modifying member variables of it, it is going to change the value to modified. Right. If I hit F10, it is going to fall through. There was no exception, but then in case of exception, it is going to give an error message that the student already exists. And if it exists, it's going to give, if the student does not exist, it is going to give an error message. But if it exists, it is going to throw an exception that for some reason we could not update the record. And then it is once again going to the index action and I'm going to hit F5. And then the first record is modified. I don't know what is the sorting strategy, but then I think it is going to be available down at the bottom again. So we change the name and the record is updated. Alright, it is already 9 o'clock. Let's take a quick 10-minute break. We're going to start again in 10 minutes. Okay, guys. Right. So we looked at the two implementations of HTTP GET and HTTP POST through the create and the edit example. Create does not take any argument. Edit takes the ID parameter for looking up the element and filling out the UI controls. And the post action for both of them is almost the same. It's just that it's going to do an update. And for update, it requires access to the existing object already. The delete action is almost the same. You can delete using the ID parameter. It is going to come and delete. It's going to look up the element, and once again in the post, it is going to execute the remove action on the remove method on the student property. Oh, nice. Sorry. Right. So going back, the edit and create action they are same. It is just that the edit is going to take an extra ID parameter for looking up the existing member. It's going to modify that. The delete action is almost the same. It is going to show you the details of the selected element, and then in the post action, it is going to execute the actual remove method. Right? The student exist method is, I don't know, but it is getting used. Right. So in the alright, so this is a helper method that was added for the edit action. I wanted to show you how these actions get created, and I have a tool called Postman. So inside right. So there's a tool called Postman, and the application that we are running here, we can execute part or most of the application inside Postman as well. So let's go ahead and enter https localhost 5001, and I'm going to change this to students slash, yeah, I can leave it this. So the method, the HTTP method that we are invoking is the HTTP get, and we are calling the student controller, and because there is no action specified, it's going to hit the index action. With that, if I click the send button, it's going to come back with this HTML. It is the same HTML that is going to get rendered on the screen as well, but I wanted to show you something else. Notice the first thing, that the status code is 200, which is okay. The time it took is a little over a second. Then there are no cookies that we have sent, and if we look at the header information, it is saying that the response itself is text/html, and there's a date, and the server is the server information is also printed here, right? The header that we are sending, it says there's a content type, and we are it is application/json. Uh, an HTML request is comprised of multiple parts. See if I can go back to the whiteboard. There are at least two parties involved, like very obviously, a client and a server. Now, these two entities, they are communicating over the network, right? And the data that is going to flow on the wire is um, running the HTTP protocol. Now, when you, the client and server, they don't have any intuitive knowledge of each other. So communication between these two entities, it happens through messages, through packets, and this packet, based on the ISO OSI layer that we saw yesterday, it happens at all 7 levels. So the HTTP is the highest level, level 7, and it is going to create its own form of packet. And when it goes to all the way to the physical layer, it is going to get put on the LAN cable in the form of bits and bytes, and this signal is going to travel over the wire. This packet here is contains at least three information. The first is the verb, the second is the headers, and the third is the body itself. Right? Tools like Postman, they help you analyze or review this content a little differently. The method itself, HTTP, is called the verb, and based on how you are trying to access a resource, you have these 17 options. I don't know if it's 17, but you have all these options available. It is starting HTTP GET, it means that it's a fresh request, and the client is sending something to the server for the first time. A POST is generally a repeat request, a second request, and it is going to have some body elements to it, right? Put is going to modify an existing resource. Patch is going to modify only selected few resource. Delete is going to delete a resource on the server, and there are other options which that you can pick from. Generally, I've seen only these first 4 or 5 HTTP verbs getting used in heavily. So when we choose the get option and hit the send button, the client informs a lot of things to the server, that the content type that they are sending is application/JSON object. Right? There are other header element as well, and one such header element is accept. It is the accept header, and over here we can have application/XML, or what we are receiving in this particular header from the server, it is the application/HTML. There's HTML, application/XML. So if your application as a client is willing to accept response in a specific format, this is where you're going to specify it. If you have some form of authentication, right, you can specify those authentication related information over here, right? The language that you want, the caching that you want, if there is any server related tagging, or uh, if there's a char set that you want to accept, like you want to accept the um, encoding in a specific format, you can add those header values to your request. Now, header is sitting outside the main body of your request, right? This header, it gets processed at the server side, and based on these header values, a lot of decisions are made before the body processing actually starts. The body part itself is available in this request. Alright, the reason it is disabled is because get does not have a body element. But then as soon as I switch to post, notice that this body element, this body tab got enabled. And if I click on this, it is showing the body that I can send along with this request. So this is some default body that I had added in the past, but you can come here and you can specify information like the ID of this field is 1, and because it is JSON, I'll have to put it inside double quotes, right? And if you have, say, additional information like first name, you can specify those values inside double quote inside this JSON object. Now, there are multiple options inside the body itself. Like you can have form data. Because we are submitting first name and last name, I can come here and submit uh, the form elements here like this, right? And then the course ID, I'm going to pass as 3. And now, because of this post action and because of this body as form data, if I hit the send button, we are directly going to hit the post action of the create method. So I'm just trying this. Let's go ahead and see if it works. And then it went on this. It did not hit the breakpoint for some reason, but let's see if our request is added. I'm going to hit refresh and going to go all the way to the end. Right. I was hoping that this post action, right, because I did not specify the create URL here. So with this create action, I think it should hit the create action now. BC is still running. Change this to first name. Let me try a couple of things. I'm going to get these two values in sync. So first name, last name, and course ID. Course ID. And the headers, it is saying that it is accepting application/XML. I'm going to delete that. The content type, let me go ahead and remove that as well. Right. In the body, I'm sending form data, and this is the data. And if I hit the submit button now, alright, it does not let me post it, which is fine. Let's go ahead and do the get action of the student, and I'm going to set a breakpoint at the index action here. So if I hit the send button, it is coming to the index action, and the index action is going to return this result, which is going to be available in the body of the response. So if I go to body, it is going to pop up this information. This is the same HTML. The point is that you can use other tools for invoking the URLs that you are creating, and you have a lot of HTML, HTTP methods, and these methods, they are going to help you customize these 3 sections of a request: and the verb, the header information itself, and the body of the data. And then this body is then posted to the server side, which comes and connects to one of these actions, and the information is available in these members, right? So we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about another concept, which is called uh, the extension methods and the middleware for like the last two topics for today. Uh, the service collection itself, it holds the information of all the dependencies that are present in the application. So let me go ahead and set a breakpoint over here on line 35. I'm going to hit F5. I'm going to add the services to the watch list. And over here, notice that this collection has about 253 elements inside it. If I expand the result view, notice that there's a lifetime called singleton. The service type itself is iHosting environment, iHosting builder, and there is something called as iLogger. Then there is a logging configuration, there is console formatter. We are used to adding these things using the add scoped or add transient or add singleton method. But then as soon as this function came, there were a lot of services that were added already to this service collection. Now the way it is added is part of it is coming from the program.cs file through this side, and part of it is coming from these two statements over here. So add controller with views, it has its own implementation, and add db context is doing database specific activities. If I go to definition of any of these, it's going to look like this: a static class, a static function with this as the first parameter, and this is a syntax for an extension method. Now when you are working on a multi-project application, let me go ahead and stop this. When you're working on a multi-project application, you are not going to have model folder sitting alongside the web project. You're going to create a project for storing only domain model information, and because it is a separate project, it is going to get added as a DLL, a reference to your project. You are going to choose a template of .NET, which is for .NET Framework it was called class library. With .NET Core uh, it is called .NET Standard, right? So class library, and it is going to add a .NET Standard project to the solution. If I hit next, I can say university dot models, and I'm going to hit the next button. .NET 5 is fine. It is going to add a separate project to the solution. Now I can define my model classes over here. We have already seen student and courses, so let's go ahead and add a class for instructor, and I'm going to get the name in sync. But then these classes, so they can have their own implementation hierarchy and their own interfaces, their own service collections. So the way we're going to add that is, say I want to add a behavior class, say validator for these models, right? The validator is going to do validation. I'm going to define an interface called iValidator, and let's go ahead and generate the type. It is iValidator. I'm going to, okay, C# was smart enough to make it an interface, and inside this interface I'm going to add a public method called validate. Right, what we have seen so far is we are going to write our program using the interface, but then we're going to create an object of the validator, and we were relying heavily on the iService collection. But then I don't want to add the project reference to this project. I'm eventually going to add it, so let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to add that reference, and with this reference added, I can do services dot add scoped, and I'm going to say I validator. It's going to pick up the models, and I'm going to instantiate it with the validator class. So for iValidator, it is going to give me the validator object, and they are both coming from this project. But your projects, they are not going to be like one dependency. They're going to be hundreds of dependencies, the way we saw in this services collection, that at the end of this function there were about 253. and you want to have some form of control over how these services for your dependency get added. And that's when you add an extension class. So I'm going to add a new item. I'm going to say validation extensions, and the syntax for the function, I'm going to make it public, number one. Number two, I'm going to make it static, right? The rest of the syntax I'm going to pick up from any of these two implementations. So let's select this, and I'm simply going to copy this entire definition. It looks super complex, but I'm going to leave only part of the syntax. So I'm going to leave public static iService collection. I'm going to hit control dot here, and it is going to add the services dependency. So the iService collection itself is coming from Microsoft Extension Dependency Injection. This project does not have that package added yet, so I'm going to add that NuGet package. Go to browse, enter the package name, and so with this, the extension method will now be able to resolve this name. And so the first part is done. I'm going to delete all these attributes. I want this, I want a collection, and the rest is okay. I don't need any of that. Instead of add db context, I'm going to say add validation, right? And it cannot be an empty function. It has to be this. And notice the return type is iService collection. An iService collection is available to us as a member as well. So I'm going to copy this, and the last statement of this extension method will always be this .service collection. Now that we have the service collection object and everything wired up, over here I'm going to do service collection dot add scoped, the same line that we wrote in the other file. And I'm going to say validator, and it's going to instantiate this validator. Now, if this project goes on to become a very big project and you have like 200 services over here, you can add all those services in this method here. And in the main code, you are only going to write, instead of these 200 statements over here, you're going to do services dot add validation. This add validation is going to come to this function, and it's going to wire up all these validators. For us, it's all the same, so it doesn't matter. But I want to understand what is the settled message. The argument of type this cannot be inferred. T-context, I don't need T-context. I'm going to delete that. And now everything is fine. Alright, so I hope now you understand that what add controllers with views is doing. ASP.NET internally is doing mapping of all these types. I mean, the reason that home controller gets an object and we are not seeing any .add logger statement is because of those two files. We have not configured logging anywhere, but then it is still able to create that object because somewhere through these lines it is building those service collection objects. Right? If not through those, it is definitely doing it inside this particular function. And this function looks like the one that we just created. It returns an iService collection, it accepts an iService collection. This is an extension method, and inside the extension method they are doing all the mapping of the abstractions and concretions of that particular assembly. All right, so when we work on bigger projects, serious projects, we are going to create extension methods of our own. I'm going to leave it here for our reference, but then all the dependencies that you are going to build as part of a separate project, you should have an extension method which is going to bring those extensions here for you. All right, moving on. In the configure method, we have an object of our application builder. Now, this application builder is calling functions like use developer exceptions, use exception handler, use HSTS. These are all part of a framework called the middleware. Now, a middleware looks like this. Once again, we have a client. A client is going to send a request, and on the server side, this request needs some processing. Right? Suppose the user is hitting the home URL. Somebody on this side should know what to do when somebody hits the home index action. Right? It is going to do that action, but then for doing that action, it has to do a couple of things, like the static files, where we have our CSS and JavaScript files. Once this is done, probably you would also want to do some form of authentication, some form of authorization, like if they are even allowed to access the home page. When that happens, probably you would want to do some form of exception handling. You would want to do some form of logging. So the information that is flowing in the request object is assigned to a special component, and that component is called a middleware. A middleware is going to do single activity. Because of the solid principle, it is only going to do one single activity. So a middleware that is responsible for routing, it is only going to validate the routes. The one that is responsible for static files, it is only going to return static files. And authentication, exception handling, logging, they're all going to do their own activity. So it's going to look like the request comes in, and if this middleware can't process it, it is going to pass on to the next middleware in line, and that middleware is going to perform some action. If that doesn't, if it's not its request, or it is done with that request, it is going to pass on to the next component and to the next component, and then at the end it is going to start returning back to the same layer in the same route, and through this it is going to go back to the client. So the request that came in, it gets handled through multiple decorators. Right? A middleware is an implementation of the decorator design pattern. So if you remember from the design pattern class, we have talked about it through the car example. A car is only going to have drive and brake methods in it. And if you want to apply any form of authentication like these state laws, we are going to add another class, and that class is going to contain the car object. So the outside is going to have more control, more decision making ability, and it is going to decide if the inside functionality should be executed. So if the state law says that the driver is underage and cannot drive, we are going to return the response right from this point. Right? If it assumes that this can go on, it is going to pass on to the next layer. The next layer is going to do all the actions, and then it is going to pass on to the next element in line. And then this entire framework in .NET Core or MVC is the middleware framework. There are three methods through which you can implement the middleware. One is run, the second is use, and the last is map. And then the middleware, they are available through this app object. So we're going to write the simple most app object, and it is going to look like this. It is app.run, and over here, if you look at this current code, it is saying that it requires a request handler, but there are other overloads available as well. And one overload takes a context object, and it through this context you can get the request, you can get the response. Let me go ahead and show you the other objects as well. So the request and response is what is flowing in into the system, and the response is what you want to write to as the output. The user is part of the claims and authentication part. Then the connection itself is going to give you what kind of connection is flowing in, right? And if you have sessions enabled, or if you want to enable session, you want to work with session, you can use this. And if you want to work with signal R, you can use some WebSockets. We are only going to influence the response for now, and it has an element called body writer. And over here, I can do response dot writer dot write async, and this one is going to take a byte array, which is a read-only memory. So earlier there was an option available of printing something like this, hello world, but then now it doesn't take that because we'll have to encode this information to convert it to a byte category, and then that option is available through a system library called encoding dot system dot text dot encode thing over here dot utf8 dot get bytes. So the hello world message, we can pass it to this function and it is going to write it asynchronously to the system. Now this green squiggly here indicates that we are inside an async function, and this is an async method as well. Now a function that is returning a task, it can be awaited, and we have not written an await statement. So if you put this await statement, the green squiggly has gone, and now if I hit Control F5, let me go ahead and stop that. I'm going to remove all the breakpoints, Control Shift F9, and I'm going to set a new breakpoint right here. If I hit F5 now, it has started this console application and it is waiting at this breakpoint. If I hit F10, it has come to this statement, and if I hit F11 now, it is going to go inside. And the website that got opened up, or because of our chaining, when we hit the localhost 5001, it is going to display the hello world text. Now this text itself is coming from this statement over here. What we've done is we have entered the server. The server looked at the pipeline, and the pipeline said that I want to write hello world on the screen using this particular body element, and I'm not going to pass it on to any other element in the queue, right? So what we essentially have is only this one middleware which has tabbed all the incoming requests, and it is returning a constant output. Now if I go ahead and enter the /home/index action here, it is still going to return hello world. So no matter what you type here, it is going to return the same output because this middleware has taken over. It takes the incoming context, it is processing the request, and it is returning the response back to the server. I'm not very familiar with Node.js, but then if you've done any Node.js and Express.js programming, this is a very similar concept, that you receive the context object, and in that context, through that context, you can interact with the request and the response object. There are other ways through which you can create these middleware framework as well. I'm going to show you at least 2 more implementations. So let's go ahead and comment out this one first. And over here, I'm going to say app.use, and use once again is taking a func with 2 request delegates, and they are all inherent. They all now support the asynchronous implementation. So once again, we have access to the context object, and if we want to chain and pipe the new elements, what we saw in this diagram, we are going to have to accept another parameter which is called next. And then now in this request, I can perform all the other actions. So if I have any activity that I want to do over here, the logic can sit here, and then once this logic executes, I can invoke the next method using the next function call. Right? So suppose if I want to look at the request object and the headers that are available over here, I can come and enter those values here. Right? I'm going to have to stop because the code is a debug, and that's why we're getting those squigglies. And let's hover over next, and we're going to see that it's a func that is returning a task. So I can do await next, and another way of invoking a delegate is that you can type the invoke function. Right, so both are just fine. I'm going to leave it to this await next, and we're going to modify the value. We're going to monitor the value of these headers. So I'm going to put a breakpoint here, hit F5. So the application has started on port 5001, and then the application is kind of waiting for us to release this breakpoint. But then before that, let's go ahead and analyze these headers. So inside these headers, we are going to see all those values: the content length, the count. I wanted to show you something specific. I don't know if there is an accept header somewhere. All right, so remember seeing this: accept language, cookies, method. Right? They are all part of the header that we have seen inside this particular element here. So when you are sending a request, you have an option of adding headers like content type and accept and multiple other headers. These headers, they are eventually going to become part of the request object. The request object can be accessed using the context variable, and then in a pipeline, you have access to the context, the request, and the headers through these. And if you want to enforce something specific, like, let me go ahead and start this. If you're expecting a header dot first, and then I'm going to say x dot key equal to, and then you have created your custom header x hyphen 0 for some value. You expect this thing to be present, right? Any link you element is going to let you do that. If it is present, then it's fine. Then you can invoke await next. But then if it is not present, you would want to short circuit and end the flow. So the way we have written this, we are not going to call the next function, and because we are not calling the next function, the chain is going to end. And the technical term for that is short circuit. So the request came in, we analyzed the header, we were not happy about the header not being sent, and then we short circuited and returned the response from here. We did not let the rest of the processing happen. Right? So use is going to give you that ability, and it is not just headers that you can inspect here. There are a lot of things that you can do, and the middleware that we see here, they have specific intention. So let me go ahead and comment this code out, and let's look at these middleware more closely. So we're seeing that on a dev machine, we have the developer exception page, which is going to print out these stack trees. On a production machine, we are going to take them to the error page, which is in the home view. So inside home, there's an error page, or probably as part of shared, right? So as part of shared error.cshtml, it is going to display that friendly error message that something has failed in your request ID this. Following that is the HTTPS redirection. So you would want to send all the requests, even the ones that are coming on HTTP, to HTTPS. They are analyzing another header, and based on that, they are redirecting it to a different element. use static files is going to provide access to this www root folder. Right? Now there is another tag called authorization, and only authorized requests they fall through. We have not enabled authorization, but then let me go ahead and comment out this use static file, and I'm going to hit Control F5. And it was generating the UI through the browser element, but then notice that as soon as I removed these static files, all the styling, CSS and JavaScript, they've been removed from this application. Now if I go to the home page, it is, yeah, that was the home page, right? The UI that is coming back, it is without any styling. When the middleware decides that it is not responsible for any of the action, like use static file is not responsible for authentication, so it is only going to add those static files as a part of response. I'm going to add that back as a part of response, and then it is going to pass on to the next element. Now use routing is going to influence the URLs that are flowing in, and in the current version, these two middleware, they have been separated out. So use routing is going to let you select that path /home /index /student /edit, things like that. But then use authorization, it always comes after the routing has been sorted out, and authorization is going to let only the authenticated users fall through and access that particular URL. If you want to control what kind of route can be created in the application, you can come here and you can modify that pattern. So because our class is full stack developer, I can append the FSD initials here, and then with this added, if I start the application, now some of the URLs might be broken, right? So the home page is not showing anything, but then if I type FSD, it is going to go to the home / index action. And then now if I hover over student, notice in the lower right corner that it has appended FSD by default. Right? This FSD is coming from this particular mapping URL. Depending on how complex or how big application you're working on, you will have to play around with this setting, and it is part of the use endpoints middleware. Right? Now, one more thing, that the order of these middleware is extremely important. You would always want to return the static files and routing before you do authorization. If you don't do that, your login page will never get the styling that you want. It is always going to appear a plain old HTML website, and only after the successful authorization or the authentication of the user, these static files are going to take over. So this order is extremely important, and because we are talking about the order, the outermost middleware should always deal with exception handling, right? Because all these middlewares, they can crash, they can throw an exception, something can go wrong at the code level, but then the final catch is going to be these exception handling middleware, which are going to log and going to redirect route the user to a different page, and the website is going to crash gracefully. Right? It won't be a yellow screen of death, and the UI is going to look a little neat in these cases. Right? There's an option of creating custom middleware through inheritance, and you can change those middlewares as well. So for that, we are going to add a folder. So when the application is debugging, the solution explorer does funny things. I'm going to add new item. I'm going to call it custom middleware, and this custom middleware will require only a couple of objects. So read only gets only initialized in the constructor, and the type here has to be request delegate, and conventionally it is underscore next. If I can define a constructor now, let's go ahead and add a reference for this. Delete this underscore, and I'm going to initialize next to this next variable, and I'm going to add the public asynchronous method, which is and then the two parameters you're going to take is HTTP context. It is the same thing that we saw when we use the use method app.use, and over here I'm going to have another. I can put other variables, or I can just get away without it. I can take whatever action I want, like say console.writeLine inside middleware, like so. Then I'm going to do await underscore next HTTP context. This is almost the same code. This is almost the same code that we wrote during the decorator pattern. Right? We had the drive function. In the drive function, we were checking the age first, and the age was more than 18. We were calling the driver.next function, right? Or the car.drive function. Right? In this case, we don't have the car.drive function. We have the next method, but then it is connecting to what is inside it. Now, the only step left is connecting this custom middleware to our solution, and for that we'll require an extension method. So once again, we're going to do it here in line. We need a static class or extension method, public static, and I'm going to call it custom middleware extensions, and there will be another static function, public static, and this time the syntax is going to be application builder. It is going to return an application builder. Let me change this to public, and it is also going to accept the application builder. So once again, the first parameter is going to be this, and it is going to be application builder. I'm going to call it builder, and this function I'm sorry, I did not give it the right name. So the function name itself is going to be use custom middleware. My application builder is going to be part of the ASP.NET Core, and over here we're going to do return builder dot use middleware, and for the first time we're going to link to the class that we created. Right now, to make this part of our solution, we're going to have to come to startup, and because it is an extension method, it will be available to us in the app object itself. Use custom middleware, and with the right references added, it is going to work. So I'm going to hit control dot, and it is pointing to our folder structure, this particular class here. Now let's put a breakpoint here. I'm going to hit F5. If I hit F11, I'm going to go inside this extension class, this extension method that we just created, and I'm going to set another breakpoint in the invoke function. So it has wired up this middleware. Now when a request arrives, it is going to come inside the invoke function, and in the invoke function we have access to the context variable, and we can do a lot of things. So this console.writeLine is going to get printed in the output window, or if not, this output window is going to get printed in this server window inside middleware, right? inside middleware, and then it is going to chain to the next middleware in line. And if I hit F5, the rest of the application is just going to continue. So like we are back to FSD. Now this, we are back to this site, and I'm going to hit F5. Right. I'm not sure why it is not loading. So every time we run the solution, it is coming to this particular invoke function, our custom middleware. Right. I'm not sure why it is not going forward, but then it is more or less this code that is going to take care of having custom middleware. You can intercept the chain. You can take the context object, and in that context object, you can plug in your custom behavior. Right? You are not allowed to modify or write to a response object. So that is one thing that you have to take care of. You can only have logic, which is going to be non-interceptive to request and response objects. So with that said, we are already on the clock. So we're going to end our session here for today.